Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're going to be unpacking a true marvel of biology. It's this tiny, totally unassuming plant, but man, it holds some of the biggest secrets to life on Earth. We're looking at Anthoceros, a genus of hornworts that acts as a literal missing link in the epic story of plant evolution.
I mean, just think about the massive evolutionary leap it took for life to move from the oceans onto dry land. Like, what exactly bridges that gap? How do you get from simple, water-bound algae just floating around in a prehistoric sea all the way to the towering, complex forests we see outside our windows today? How on earth did simple aquatic life actually adapt to survive on land?
Well, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, an evolutionary bridge. 2, habitat and plant structure. 3, a unique symbiotic relationship. 4, strategies for reproduction. 5, the horn-like sporophyte. And finally, completing the life cycle.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, an evolutionary bridge.
Let's start right at the beginning. Anthoceros belongs to a class of bryophytes called Anthocerotopsida, but, most people just call them hornworts. Now, pay attention to the phrase right at the end of that definition, semi-independent sporophytes. In more primitive plants, the spore-producing part relies entirely on the host plant for food. It's basically a freeloader. But Anthoceros does something incredibly different, giving it a level of independence that literally set the stage for all modern land plants. Moving on to section 2, habitat and plant structure. So where do these little survivors actually live? Well, Anthoceros is cosmopolitan, which is just a fancy way of saying you can find it worldwide. But it has some pretty strict real estate demands. It absolutely requires damp, shaded, moist environments. We're talking wet soil, shaded clay banks, ditches, rocks near streams. And here's the cool part. When the rainy season comes along and exposes fresh, damp soil, they act as nature's first responders. They're often the pioneer species that arrives first to set up camp in a totally barren environment. When you look at Anthoceros, you're really looking at a plant with a dual nature. First, we've got the gametophyte. Think of this as the base station. It's a small, dark green, flat, prostrate thallus that just hugs the ground, and it's anchored by these really simple unicellular structures called rhizoids. But then, in stark contrast, growing right out of that flat base is the sporophyte. This is a highly evolved, upright, horn-like projection. And it's exactly this unique visual combo, a flat green mat pushing up these tiny green horns, that gives the plant its common name, the hornwort. Now, if we take a microscopic look inside that flat gametophyte base, things are surprisingly simple. It consists of uniform parenchymatous cells. There's no complex tissue differentiation, no fancy air chambers like you might find in related plants, but it does have 2 incredible features. First, and honestly, this is wild, almost every single cell contains just one single large disc-shaped chloroplast. And second, on its underside, the ventral side, it features these specialized mucilage cavities that open up to the outside world through tiny slime pores.
Let's zoom in on that single large chloroplast for a second, because this is where the evolutionary detective work gets really exciting. Inside the chloroplast of Anthoceros is a structure called a pyrenoid. It's basically a distinct central starch-forming body. The thing is, pyrenoids are a classic characteristic of ancient green algae. So this tiny cellular engine is like a biological fingerprint. It strongly tethers this land-dwelling plant right back to its aquatic, algae-like ancestors.
Which brings us to section 3, a unique symbiotic relationship. All right, remember those mucilage cavities with the slime pores on the underside of the plant we just talked about? Well, this is one of the plant's absolute greatest survival tricks. Those cavities don't just sit there empty. They're frequently colonized by a cyanobacterium called nostoc. Nostoc literally moves in and establishes a symbiotic relationship with the hornwort. It essentially acts as an Airbnb tenant, but it pays rent in fertilizer. Because Anthoceros often lives as a pioneer species on raw, nutrient-poor soil, it relies on nostoc to fix atmospheric nitrogen for it. It's just a brilliant evolutionary partnership. Let's dive into section 4, strategies for reproduction. So with survival secured, the plant turns its attention to multiplying. Anthoceros actually has a whole toolkit for cloning itself vegetatively, which, as you can imagine, is absolutely crucial for a pioneer species dealing with unpredictable, harsh environments. First, there's fragmentation. If the older back parts of the plant naturally decay, the younger front lobes just detach and keep growing as independent plants. Then there are tubers, thick-walled structures they build like tiny survival bunkers to wait out bad conditions and resume growth later. And some specific species even produce gemmi, stalked multicellular vegetative bodies perfectly designed to drop off and grow into new clones. But Anthoceros also reproduces sexually, and this brilliantly illustrates its primitive, water-dependent nature. You see, both male and female organs develop directly within the flat tissue of the gametophyte. The male organs, the antheridia, grow inside closed endogenous chambers and eventually release motile biflagellate antherozoids, which is just a fancy way of saying swimming sperm cells. Meanwhile, the female organs, the archegonia, don't stick out. They are embedded right in the thallus tissue, holding a single egg cell deep down inside a mucilage-filled neck.
So how do they actually connect? Well, water is absolutely indispensable here. Because those male antherozoids have flagella, little tails for swimming, they literally have to physically swim through a precarious film of moisture, like a tiny puddle of rainwater or morning dew, right, across the surface of the plant to find the female archegonium. Once there, they swim down that mucilage-filled neck and fuse with the egg to create a diploid zygote. This shows us something profound. Even though Anthoceros lives on land, its sexual reproduction is still fundamentally changed to the water.
All right, here's where things get really cool. Section 5, the horn-like sporophyte. Once fertilization happens, that diploid zygote divides and pushes upward, creating that tiny horn we discussed earlier. And it's built in 3 distinct steps. First, at the bottom, we have the foot, a bulbous embedded base that absorbs nutrients from the gametophyte below it. Above that, think of the meristematic zone as a biological engine. It's a region of actively dividing cells constantly pushing new material upward. And that upward push forms the third part, the capsule. That's the long, upright cylinder that you actually see growing continuously above ground. Now, if we were to slice that capsule open, we'd find an intricate internal anatomy designed for one specific purpose: making and launching spores. Running right down the center is the columella, which acts like the plant's spine, providing mechanical support so the horn stands tall. Surrounding that is the sporogenitious tissue, or archosporium. This produces the actual spore mother cells, along with tiny sterile pseudoelators that act like little biological springs to fling the spores away. And encasing all of this is the multi-layered green capsule wall. Okay, so why does all this matter? Why is Anthoceros considered an evolutionary superstar? It all comes down to that capsule wall. It contains functional stomata with guard cells. These are the exact same breathing pores that leaves on giant oak trees have. Plus, it has chlorophyll. This means the sporophyte isn't just a freeloader draining food from its mother plant. It can photosynthesize and manufacture its own food semi-independently. This tiny little bit of independence, that was the major evolutionary leap that paved the way for the complex, towering land plants we see today. Bringing it all together in Section 6, completing the life cycle. We've seen how it grows and why it's so unique, so let's watch this whole biological story loop back to its beginnings. This loop is known as a heteromorphic diplohaplobiontic life cycle. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, but it simply means the plant continuously alternates between 2 distinct, different-looking generations. You've got the flat, haploid gametophyte base station we started with, and the upright, diploid sporophyte horn that grows right out of it. It's an endless, beautiful cycle of alternating forms. To keep that cycle going, the mature horn obviously needs to release its payload. It does this through a process called dehiscence. As the top of the capsule matures, it slowly splits open from the apex downward, along vertical slits. And because that meristem engine at the base is constantly growing new tissue, spores are liberated progressively over a long period of time. It's a continuous release. And to survive the outside world, each of those microscopic, haploid spores is heavily armored with a thick, sculptured wall to protect it against the elements.
And finally, the journey concludes exactly where it began. When one of those tough, thick-walled spores happens to land on a suitable, moist substrate, maybe a freshly exposed clay bank right after a heavy rainstorm, it germinates. It puts out tiny rhizoids, it develops uniform cells filled with those pyrenoid-packed chloroplast, and it grows into a brand new, totally independent haploid Anthoceros thallus. The base station is rebuilt, just waiting for the rain, ready to start the whole cycle all over again. We've traced the incredible journey of Anthoceros today, from simple cells that look a whole lot like algae to complex, stomata-bearing horns literally reaching for the sky. It is a living, breathing blueprint of how life conquered the land. Knowing that this ancient evolutionary bridge is operating silently right beneath our feet, fixing nitrogen, swimming through microscopic puddles, and launching spores into the wind, will you ever look at a damp patch of green earth the same way again?
Keep observing, keep questioning, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.